So welcome everybody. We also now live on YouTube and we can start soon. So maybe Michelle, you want to take over?
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all our participants. My name is Michelle Maziwisa. I am a member of the African Women's Development and Communication Network, FEMNET, which is also a co-chair of the Gender and Trade Coalition. I'm moderating this webinar on behalf of a group of organizers, including the Forum Umwelt und Entwicklung, White Plus, Women Equals Men, Anders Handel, Gender and Trade Coalition, and the Seattle to Brussels Network. Before I start introducing the topic and the speakers for today's webinar, I would like to mention briefly some practicalities to help our participants to follow the conversation. You will see in the panel below on the screen an icon of a world globe. If you click on this, you can choose for the interpretation into Spanish or German. You can also mute the original audio. The German interpretation is available for presentations, and after this, you can also listen to the English or the Spanish translations. The webinar will be 1.5 hours, and after our speakers' contributions, we'll allow an opportunity for the audience to pose any questions that you may have. If you would like to ask a question or a comment, you can use the chat section at the bottom of your panel. And you can also use that if you would like to share your contributions pertaining to this webinar, or if you have any other work in your organization that you'd like to share with the participants, you can also add it to the chat. In the hope that we have enough time for all questions, we'll also allow for live contributions from the audience. And if you would like to take the floor and ask your question, either via audio or video, please indicate this when you put your question in the chat or your comment. Also kindly note that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, and we'll be making the webinar available after the event. If you want to remain anonymous, it therefore becomes important for you to consider changing your name or anonymizing it on your Zoom profile, because otherwise your real name will show and you will not be able to remain anonymous. We're committed to a civilized feminist exchange and interaction, and as the organizers, we reserve our right to exclude anyone who uses offensive or discriminatory language or who abuses this space in an undemocratic or an anti-feminist way. And now that we have the practicalities out of the way, let's get into today's topic. Our topic for today is food sovereignty and health for all women worldwide, how the EU is blocking it in the World Trade Organization, the WTO. This web seminar helps to educate those interested and involved in citizens' actions to better understand why our economic system is structured so unequally for many people, in particular to many women. It will reflect on how the EU and EU member states continue to legalize this inequality. And our reflection will zoom in on the World Trade Organization, especially pertaining to the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, which is the global agreement on who can own intellectual property and under which conditions. We will start this conversation with a presentation from Wan Kyong-Hu, who is a senior legal and policy advisor at Médecins Sans Frontières, who will, in 15 minutes, take us through the arguments for a TRIPS waiver and the counter-arguments of the EU. And thereafter, I'll also invite Ranja Sengupta, who is the senior economist with the Third World Network, to dig deeper into the processes and structure of the WTO as a powerful institution, explaining to us how the EU is continuing to negotiate for global rules to support European business at the expense of women's access to health and to food. And Ranja will have 25 minutes. Thereafter, we'll take some questions for the audience. And now, without further ado, let me invite you, Wan, to please give us your contributions in 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you, everyone, and thanks for inviting us to be here. So I share my screen quickly. Presentation. So I will go through quickly why, especially from Médecins Sans Frontières perspective, we have been supporting and working together with other civil society organizations since last year, supporting the TRIPS waiver process. For us, the movement asking for TRIPS waiver in the middle of the unprecedented pandemic of a century really bring us back to the history, connecting to the decades of struggle by people in low and middle income countries, asking for justice and asking for access to medicines from HIV/AIDS epidemic and traveling through the past 2 decades. And MSF have been honored to be part of this movement. And then, so that's really bring us back to the root of the struggle. And in the pandemic, we also know for the moment, the demand for the waiver have been very well connected to the broader movements we see in the past few years, when the deeper inquiry of the injustice, discrimination, marginalization of population living in developing countries have been manifested in many different fronts, including health. So we have seen civil society organization when demanding the waiver made a link with other political movement they are leading. And for the moment, after more than 1 year of delay, the map shown to the right-hand side clearly shows the structural issue we're facing now. It's not just about single medicine or vaccines. There's a structural problem facing us when it's come to the waiver discussion and access to medical treatment and all of the tools. So we have seen a continued challenge in accessing to all life-saving medical tools in COVID. As MSF, we have been responding to more than 16 countries since the beginning of the pandemic, treating patients infected by COVID also, and at the same time try to maintain other essential health care services we provide for many population that has already been marginalized before the pandemic. And the challenge of accessing to the medical tools and the lacking of the adequate equipment and protection for healthcare workers is a day-to-day struggle in many countries where we work by our team and the colleagues we work with. And then, so in this context, we really see when it's come to access barrier, we really think there's multiple levels of barrier we're seeing now. There's a structural issues with when it's come to intellectual property, access to medicines. When for many, the past more than 2 decades, particularly following the establishment of WTO's TRIPS agreement, when more countries are required to grant IP protection, patent protection on medical products, this kind of private rights have enabled private enclosure of R&D research and development outcome funded and supported by public resources. And the intellectual property monopoly also enables the control of technology ownership and the decision-making power. And so in the pandemic, for instance, we have seen the primary power in making the decision on where the medicine and vaccine and diagnostic can be produced, how many of them can be produced, and where to supply at what price are primarily determined by private sector, backed by the IP ownership they have, despite of the massive public support in the pandemic to drive the scientific breakthrough. And there's also normative barriers when such inherent limitations of relying on companies' voluntary action, which is one of the central arguments by the EU, if we talk about how EU behave to see how access should be managed. And also other blocking country in the waiver negotiation, including the Switzerland and UK, their argument is trust the company, rely on the voluntary actions, do a little bit adjustment of the TRIPS flexibility, you don't need a waiver. but we can do a bit later, illustrate a bit later. So that there's a normative barrier to just rely on companies' willingness. And then there's also a limitation in the international regime, particularly under TRIPS agreement, which is agreement concluded without any knowledge and experience of a pandemic, which the rule has already posed challenges in other disease areas. Although there's some flexibilities content and the TRIPS agreement, there's other practical challenges for country to use them in full. And particularly, there's no mechanism and the TRIPS framework to respond to the particular challenge we're facing now in the pandemic. There's also overall lacking of transparency, accountability on companies' intellectual property strategy, technology transfer strategy, making sure that the pandemic medical tools are really treated, produced, and provided as a global public good, as some of the world leaders so claimed last year. But there's no mechanism to deliver those promise and rhetoric. And there's also political barrier. So after more than 1 year of negotiation and delay to adopt the waiver as an emergency temporary measure responding to the pandemic, we actually see a very clear political will play a very critical role in hindering countries to really come together, working under solidarity. So, and there's also practical barrier when it's come to using the existing legal and policy options. There are some legal and policy options country can use. However, there are limitations there. And we are now facing a scenario that's not just about patents when it's comes to intellectual property, but also other type of intellectual property related to confidential information and some of the very important information about production that is often claimed as a trade secret by company without adequate legal remedy to protect public interests. So when it's come to the kind of consideration of how government should address those monopoly power and the multiple level of barrier, we think that the strategy should consider making the government as a major duty barrier to issue universal access, which is not yet the case because of the overwhelming reliance on private sector's willingness and voluntary action. Therefore, when South Africa and India initially proposed the TRIPS waiver proposal back in October 2020 and later submitted the revision text this year, we think this is really a concrete and critical policy and option that could overcome some of those practical and normative barriers and provide a clear legal pathway for country to choose to use. So far, the waiver has been supported by more than 60 developing countries officially, and many more countries are supporting the waiver process. And the scope of the technology and the scope of IP as proposed under the current waiver protection is also sufficient and comprehensive, very, very adequate, reflecting the challenge we're facing. Meaning that even though now many attention was put on vaccines, as a medical organization, we know also we can't just rely on vaccine to control this pandemic. We need all of the life-saving technology and the medical tool to be available for health workers in different countries in order to end this pandemic. And we need the therapeutics, medicines, protective equipment as together with vaccine, because the spread of the virus is still very uncertain. So the scope of IP is also adequate and comprehensive, going beyond just patent, but also looking at the undisclosed information that has been claimed for protection by many companies, and that is covering some of the essential information and data that could help production supply by alternative companies. And then so I didn't put all of the meeting agenda here, and we know the negotiation is ongoing, And from information so far, there is really a very small group of high-income countries remain at the outright opposing situation, a position that is hindering this process to go forward. So we could potentially have a waiver as proposed by South Africa and India get adopted at the ministerial conference. That would be a huge breakthrough. And we also consider, if there's a ministerial conference without the waiver decision, it would be a sign of the failure of global solidarity, a sign of a failure for countries to really concretely working together and coming together to concretely can defeat this pandemic. So this slide shows some of the key arguments. The EU and its alliance, and also pharmaceutical companies, there's some high level of similarity of what the EU, UK, Switzerland are arguing and what pharmaceutical companies are arguing. So we just kind of summarize some of the key points here. The first one is IP is not a barrier. It's a little bit surprising, but also frustrating to observe that more than nearly 2 years now in the pandemic, when there's evidence, increasing evidence of how private monopoly are hindering global access, we continue to hear government claim, the blocking governments of the UK, Switzerland, and some of the EU government claim IP is not a barrier. So there's nothing need to be done. IP enables the research and development in COVID-19. But the reality actually provides a contrary evidence when we have actually seen increasing evidence when IP is indispensable barrier actually to hinder the global diversified production and supply of the essential medical tools. And then as we said earlier, the public funding is not about IP. It's not IP who enabled the research and development in COVID-19. It is public funding and the global effort. It is because of scientists in different countries rapidly shared their knowledge about this virus that is opened up the whole R&D process. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a single vaccine today. It's not because of intellectual property. It's about the knowledge that has been shared freely, openly by the scientific community. And then there's also argument saying that voluntary licensing and voluntary action is sufficient. And we also see the contrary when voluntary license and actions are not sufficient. There's multiple examples we can talk about from the vaccine context and from therapeutic context. When, for instance, we see WHO has actually tried to establish different mechanisms, at least two of them, encouraging voluntary sharing of technologies, licensing and sharing data. One is the COVID technology access pool initiatives, so-called CTAP, established early on in the pandemic. The second one is more recent, mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub that WHO is working with South Africa government and entities in South Africa, aiming to facilitate transfer of technology voluntarily and then to enable more dissemination of technology. But regretfully, no industry have actually come forward to join CTAP and to join the technology transfer hub. mRNA, the major mRNA vaccine producers so far, such as Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, they would rather do their own thing than really work with WHO and voluntarily transfer the technology. So the argument that voluntary license is sufficient is totally flawed. And recently we see the first voluntary license signed between the Medicines Patent Pool and the Merck on one of the COVID therapeutics candidates. But interestingly, two things can be observed. First, this license is not signed under the CTAP framework. And secondly, after analysis, we find this license have very limited practical added value to change the current dynamic of access and then to really provide a more sustainable and diversified supply freedom for many low and middle income countries who actually have existing capacity that can rapidly produce the Merck medicine without being restricted. And then other argument which EU have said a lot is that the existing public health safeguard flexibilities and the TRIPS agreement are sufficient. So countries don't need anything else. So you just do, compulsory license and do other flexibilities. That's enough. Why don't you do it? So the question, why don't countries use those flexibilities? And why do you ask for waiver? There's already flexibility there allowed by TRIPS agreements. But then our analysis also demonstrate that those flexibilities are limited in the situation of the pandemic. But there's also political and practical obstacles. Because historically, for the past 2 decades, actually, EU and the US particularly, they have been systematically discouraging other countries to use those flexibilities in the interest of protecting big industry. So many countries have been chilled and discouraged and sometimes threatened not to use those flexibility for 2 decades, which otherwise could have been more prepared, in national law. So how hypocritical we would say EU and others suddenly say, okay, in the pandemic, every country should be 100%, 120% ready to use all of the flexibility for the pandemic. It is simply not possible. And the flexibility also limited. As we said, the TRIPS agreement signed more than 2 decades ago has no vision and understanding of what pandemic means. So many of the provisions are limited to the extent. Other arguments also include the other global initiatives such as COVAX, ACTA, managed by a few global health institutions are sufficient. So countries in the South just need to wait, so they will get it anyway, sooner or later. But then the reality shows that majority of the mechanism actually failed. So we also recently come up with analysis, and many other organizations have done so, to see how flawed the global initiative were. Firstly, they were designed only with a market-driven mechanism in mind. The whole scenario is to keep market open, keep pharma happy, and the low and middle income countries, civil society were not really adequately around the decision-making table, making sure the global initiative actually reflect global vision. And the other arguments also includes, even if intellectual property barrier is removed, developing country cannot produce COVID-19 vaccines and medicines, but also to the country that ample of evidence showing that this is totally wrong. And developing countries have been producing medicines and vaccines for such a long time, and on different type of vaccines and medicines. It's simply an ignorance to claim there's no capacity in developing country to produce what's needed in COVID-19. It is because of the technology monopoly that hindered country to be able to quickly come up to production. And then also there's a last argument sometimes put forward by industry and took by some high-income government, saying that the intellectual property holder, oftentimes referring to multinational pharmaceutical company, are the best to produce safe and quality products. This is also a totally flawed claim, because we also see the counter evidence. Developing country manufacturers have been producing quality assured, safe medicine for decades. And then to the contrary, the quality and safety requirements applies to all kinds of producers, no matter where they are from. And we have also seen quality and safety issues even with the multinational industry in this pandemic. So I will probably stop quickly here after reviewing all of the major arguments, and EU is part of that. So hopefully when the negotiation come forward, some of these myths and the false argument could be further countered, that we could potentially have a waiver by MC12. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan. Thank you for taking us through a bit of the background of the TRIPS waiver. You also took us through the different types of barriers that are in place, and also the myths in relation to the realities in the debate around intellectual property and access during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much for providing that background. And now, that background and arguments. And now I'd like to move on over to Ranja. I see you're ready for us. Please go ahead. You have 25 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Michelle, and thank you, Yuan, for that fantastic presentation. And that really kind of puts in context the challenge that we face today. So let me just share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Thanks.
Okay. So my job here today is to take you back a little bit and give you a bit of a background of in a way, the politics of the WTO and the conflict that it pitches us in. I mean, I will talk a lot about developing countries, but actually it's true for, everybody around the world, because frankly, we've seen that parts of Europe, they also face tremendous crisis in accessing, the medicines and the medical supplies they needed. But I think for developing countries and for marginalized constituencies within developing countries, I would say the South within the South, they have been hurt much more. And that's why I think today's discussion becomes very relevant, because it also focuses on the gender dimension of it, and why does it have kind of, any different implication for women. And I'm very happy to talk about all these issues. So one is, of course, TRIPS and the right to health, but also food sovereignty issues. And that's also linked to actually health, but also livelihoods. And frankly, if you don't have livelihoods, if you do not earn, you do not buy either your food or your medicines. So it's very, very difficult to survive without livelihoods. So how the WTO, the history of the WTO actually shows and poses continuously these conflicts to these essential needs that, we as a community have. So just to take you through this quickly, the WTO, when it was signed in 1995, we had a few agreements. One was the agreement on agriculture, which I would focus a bit on today, because we are going to talk about food sovereignty. Then there's NAMA, which was the, the industrial trade issues, like trade in goods in industrial products. Then GATS, which is the services agreement, TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights, and then TRIMS, which is investment, and a host of other agreements. But I think these 5 were the major ones. And in a way, NAMA and even GATS and TRIMS have not moved so much, but we really see that the AOA and the TRIPS have both been implemented pretty kind of strongly across the globe. There's been a lot of push to get these implemented, and we've had major impacts, and kind of all of it in a way has like shown us the adverse impacts of WTO rules. So why did I think the interesting thing is, developing countries are net consumers of IP. They don't really, especially when the WTO was signed, they were not the ones producing this technology and knowledge. So they are neither owners nor exporters of intellectual property. So why did they sign the TRIPS agreement? But of course, firstly, there was a massive push of corporations across US, EU, and Japan, led by Pfizer, IBM, but a lot of European companies as well. So they all came together. And in fact, Pfizer, I think, boasted that our combined strength enabled us to establish a global private sector government network, which laid the groundwork for what became TRIPS. So this body of corporations, they kind of pitched on intellectual property rights, and they lobbied with governments, obviously very, very successfully. And that kind of gave them, like, wrapped up, gift wrap the TRIPS agreement. Because as Juan explained, what does it do? It actually secures the so-called innovators' rights, right? Like, so they innovate, they come up with something, but then they have monopolies on these critical products, like medical products. And that has raised prices worldwide. But to come back to that question, why did developing countries then, why would they sign it? One is they wanted to get this equal status, which is called the most favored nation status in the WTO. that, okay, if some country is imposing certain kind of import duty on country A, then B will get the same duty. So just because, say, I do not like B, I cannot slap higher import duties on B, which most countries wanted to get. But again, we see that, now 26 years after the WTO was signed, this really hasn't happened. I mean, we see that, firstly, the FTAs are there, the bilateral trade agreements. So kind of the duties that countries have with each other have totally changed from what the WTO suggested. And then there are different ways, like Trump, for example, unilaterally raised import duties, violating actually all kinds of WTO rules. So we know that it's basically political power which has determined this. And we've seen, and we still see, that it's not at all true that all countries get the same treatment in WTO. I mean, I think the difference between the developed and developing countries, and even some difference among developing countries, is like very, very clear in the WTO, right? But the next issue is very important for us today because, developing countries, I would say, were almost lured into the WTO and agreed to sign also the TRIPS agreement, in which they had no interest, because they thought they would get agriculture, because they were told that, agriculture is what you guys produce, developing countries. You have comparative advantage in agriculture. So you can sell that agricultural products to the industrialized countries, but give us access to, for our industrial products, give us access to your markets, developing country markets. And you will get, one is access to our agriculture markets, and also textile markets in developed countries. So they were promised this, like this agriculture was their area of interest, offensive interest, like they wanted to export agricultural products, right? So this was, I mean, it is believed that this was one of the major reasons why they signed on both to the AOA and to the TRIPS agreement, and they kind of came into the WTO. But again, I mean, this is what we will discuss. They have not got really benefits in agriculture either, mainly because the developed countries continued to give very high subsidies. And in fact, this was one of the reasons why developing countries wanted an agreement on agriculture, because this was the space, they were told, where countries which give subsidies, because then it would give some advantage to their own producers. So since US, EU, these countries were already giving very high subsidies, Switzerland, Canada, and so on, they thought these could be negotiated down, so that it would create a level playing field for farmers everywhere. But we have seen that it hasn't happened, but I'll go back to that discussion. Also, I believe that the US, which was using Article 301 to push their own IP standards, and they thought that, this would come to like a multilateral body, so it would be all agreed and you would have agreed intellectual property standards and rules. But that the US is still using Article 301. It keeps using it to actually challenge, even when countries implement the TRIPS agreement. But for example, when India issued compulsory license, they were actually threatened that they are violating Article 301. So US has its kind of own laws and rules and standards, and it keeps kind of superimposing those on top of what the WTO commitments are. So basically, interestingly, so now we see that, what they signed on. So none of the reasons for which developing countries had agreed to sign the TRIPS agreement actually delivered, right? So they, I think, in particular, both from the agreement on agriculture and the TRIPS agreement, they have been losing. So the TRIPS agreement, Yuan already put it very well. It compromises access to medicines, vaccines, healthcare, etc. And of course, this is global, but in developing countries, it is felt more severely because because a lot of these products and services were not developed in, we did not have these, and we could not, in some cases, we could not develop these pharmaceutical industries, for example, and where they are, for example, in India, Thailand, in parts of the world where we had generic pharmaceutical industry, they have been finding it very difficult to actually grow and sustain themselves, frankly, given what the TRIPS commitments have been on intellectual property rights. So now countries realized this very soon, that they were actually, it was very difficult to protect public health, given the TRIPS agreement, right? Given this very strong rights, that the IP rights that the innovator had to be kind of granted legally in our countries. So then after a lot of, I think, political work, the Doha Declaration on Public Health was signed in 2001. So it kind of really talked about the TRIPS flexibilities, that countries, firstly, that they are free, they should have the policy space to pursue public health objectives, and that they were free, they should use the TRIPS flexibilities, these flexibilities, which one already talked about, compulsory licenses and others. But what we see that now, that when we come, for example, when COVID, we are faced with COVID, that even the flexibilities are not enough. And Yuan is much better placed than me to explain that. And she did that, I think, very well. But some of these flexibilities, for example, compulsory licenses, etc., take also very long. These are complex processes. They really cannot meet the needs that we have, this urgent, immediate crisis that we need to respond to. So basically this fight, this dual challenge, this fight for developing countries, especially to protect, on the one hand, agricultural production, livelihoods, food security on the one hand, and then they are also fighting to protect access to medicines on the other. Now, where does gender come into this? Frankly, I mean, I think like a colleague of mine put it so well, frankly, every issue is a gender issue because they are half the population. So what happens to finance, to intellectual property rights, to trade, to any policy, frankly? I mean, somehow it's believed that women have no interest in economic policies. They're only interested in, violence against women and so on. But that is not true. I mean, women know that these policies, economic, social, environmental policies, everything, they have a big stake in this. But in particular, I think the WTO agreements, trade policy, and intellectual property rights policies have very clear gender dimensions, though the TRIPS agreement will never say, on paper that, okay, women should have they should pay higher prices and so on. But we know that there are ground level inequalities, right? Like gender-based inequalities. And this is not only in developing countries. Sometimes I think in developing countries, maybe it is more pronounced in some ways because overall access to, certain products and overall the economic pie is smaller, like in developing countries. So the fight, who gets it, is bigger. And therefore, those who are marginalized, those who have less economic and political power will always lose out. But I think these inequalities you see in the developing world also. So, but as I said that, when, for example, in developing countries, when your healthcare system is smaller, when your public health system is weaker, then women, we see, always will get less access. Like they will go, they will, if they have some illness, they will tolerate it till it's unbearable, only then they will go to the hospital. And for example, and this, the TRIPS agreement has increased prices globally on critical products. And I think Yuan mentioned HIV/AIDS medicines, right? And from India, like when I was talking to HIV infected women, and the couples, when in the case of infected couples, they were saying, for example, our government provides free medicine for stage 1, but 2 onwards, it's patented and very expensive. So when you go to these, medicines which are patented and more expensive, also, for example, sometimes the government, even stage 1 medicines, they run out of stocks. And what happens? The women give up treatment. So the TRIPS agreement doesn't say that women should not have access to antiretrovirals, but they do not have, because that is the ground reality. And that was like shocking for me to hear that, because this is a reality. And this means that, this kind of impacts, gender-based impacts, we simply cannot address unless we change the agreement. These days there's a lot of discussion on gender and trade in the WTO, and suddenly the WTO and many developed countries are very concerned about the gender impacts of trade. But this is not like a band-aid fix. Unless you fix, the agreement, the whole agreement, you actually cannot address this gender-based impacts. So even, and we have seen this even during COVID, that, like for vaccines access, and medicines and treatment, like wherever access is skewed, women will always have less access, right? And so the thing is this, the waiver, if we look at the waiver now coming, so this has been the history of the TRIPS agreement. Every country had to pass laws to recognize these patent rights because they have to implement the TRIPS agreement. And we have seen globally prices of medicines increasing, and the generic pharma industry, which makes copy medicines, they have kind of shrunk. India, my country, which actually has large generic production, they have been struggling, frankly. And a lot of these are critical medicines for women. The waiver, so now comes COVID, and the waiver, I would say, in a way, it's the only positive move, is the only ray of hope in very, very depressing and very, very saddening, history of the WTO. For a long time, and we have seen developing countries fight, in the area of agriculture, even TRIPS, even to issue compulsory licenses, like what Yuan was saying, that these were challenged. Like now what EU is talking about, use the flexibilities, but they have continuously challenged when developing countries tried to use these flexibilities. So now with the waiver, frankly, when you actually transfer technology, and governments, of course, there's a lot of follow-up work to be done, and it has so much support, from over 100 members, but we see that a few countries are blocking. Unfortunately, Germany, leading the EU, Switzerland, UK, and we've seen other proposals coming, like from the Ottawa group, so led by Canada, but EU is a major player in the Ottawa group, and they have been continuously pushing on their trade and health initiative. And it never mentions intellectual property rights. It doesn't mention the TRIPS waiver, but it just keeps saying, oh, we will talk to manufacturers and fix supply constraints and export restrictions, and everybody should, developing countries especially, should liberalize more. So actually, these are very dangerous kind of proposals, which even now, so there's a process, kind of like a pandemic response that the WTO is thinking of coming up at the 12th ministerial. And this whole trade and health, the things that they propose, liberalize e-commerce, use trade facilitation. So all the issues which are sensitive for developing countries from a policy perspective, implies that their policy space will be more constrained, and that deeper penetration into their markets. Those are the issues being pushed to these initiatives now using COVID, frankly. Now COVID has been hijacked to actually kind of take forward the same agenda that we've seen from the EU and these other developed countries. Surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, the US has supported a limited version of this. But then we continuously keep hearing that, no waiver, no, do not touch intellectual property rights, anything else but that, like all kinds of other solutions. But we have seen that, like even when Moderna, Pfizer, when they are having contracts with other manufacturing companies in developing countries, these are not for transfer of technology. This is just like what are called fill and finish contracts. You just manufacture it for me, you bottle it and send it. It is not technology transfer. And without that, there simply cannot be global production on the scale that we need. Quickly then, and as I said, so on the one hand, we knew TRIPS agreement would hurt public health objectives globally, but also in developing countries. And it has done exactly that. I think it has fulfilled our fears and expectations fully. But alongside, as I said, developing countries were supposed to benefit in agriculture. They have not. And I would say agriculture and fisheries both, because now fisheries subsidies are being negotiated a bit on the lines of the agreement on agriculture, what the AOA did on subsidies. So again, I think like White Plus, I do not have to tell you like how gender sensitive these sectors are, especially in developing countries. A lot of our women simply work as farmers, as agriculture workers, fish workers, and a lot of women are in fish selling. Like they just take the fish from the coastal areas, they will sell it in local markets, like very small scale operations, and these are their mainstay because these need less resources and skill. And so women, like for them, it's easy to be engaged in these sectors, often home-based, very small scale, especially in our countries. It is often it's not like, business oriented. It's not corporate led at all. It's very, very smallholder based, which makes it easy for women to operate in these kind of sectors. And I think in developing countries, these sectors have been based on local production, and women have played a major role in sustaining local varieties, in biodiversity, and really protecting food sovereignty. Because what we see is that from the WTO, they have pushed only a certain type of big products which developed countries produce, and they heavily subsidize. So these products have come into our markets, and which means, for example, we had coarse cereals, very nutritious and very fitting for our health needs, like, because even our bodies are kind of acclimatized to the climate and the weather that we live in, right? So some kind of food are natural, like they really are good for our body, but we are always importing these products, subsidized products, which may come in cheap from developed countries, and that's totally wiping out local varieties of food, biodiversity, and really kind of threatening our food sovereignty. Now the AOA is again neutral on paper, no gender discrimination, right? But as I said, because these, dairy products, cereals from EU and US remain some of the largest subsidizers of agricultural products. US cotton has destroyed cotton farmers in Africa. So they give, the rich countries managed to negotiate. When the AOAs was signed, they managed to negotiate these extra subsidy entitlements for themselves. So they are allowed to give much more subsidies than most developing countries or LDCs are even allowed to. Forget the financial power and so on. They have the right to give. And during COVID, US, EU have given huge subsidies, and really not farmers, right? These are like big agribusiness. They have given a lot of, there's an OECD paper which shows that the OECD countries gave huge agricultural subsidies to their farmers and farming companies. The OECD papers are saying it's agribiz, right? Whereas actually developing countries they have much more severe constraints under the AOA rules. The agreement on agriculture is one of the most inequitable, unfair agreements actually even within the WTO. And then the developed countries have also used so-called green box, which are supposed to be the good subsidies, like non-trade distorting. But there's a lot of criticism that especially EU uses green box in a very, very trade distorting way. But what they have cleverly done is shifted what are very obviously trade distorting subsidies to green box, and that's why they actually subsidize heavily. And these have, for example, in the Philippines, in the Cordillera region, it was famous for rice farming. A lot of women farmers used to operate, but European subsidized rice has gone into those markets, and it's really wiping out local varieties and also farming by women farmers. Now, the interesting thing is that they have not even cut subsidies, and they have really used different ways and tricks to continue to subsidize agribusiness. But on the other hand, now they are telling developing countries, because developing countries use, like they give price support to farmers for public food programs. Many of our countries are crucially dependent on these big food programs. India has one of the largest in the world. And during COVID, developing countries it has shown us the use. Lot of, workers who lost jobs, people during lockdown, they got food through the public food programs. But you cannot have such public food programs unless you actually support farmers also. So it has to give a subsidy to consumers to give them cheap food. But to run these programs, you must procure from farmers by also giving them a price support. And these price support subsidies in the WTO are calculated in a very, very peculiar way. I cannot go into details. There's no time, because I think AOA needs like one full day of its own. But like many countries are now reaching what the WTO limits were set. And now the developed countries, US, Canada, EU, are challenging them that you are exceeding support limits, you are violating WTO rules, we will sue you, you cannot do this. And that's the fight we are now seeing since 2013, since the Bali Ministerial. This has been going on. Developing countries are fighting that for a permanent solution, because they got some interim solution, which is not at all usable actually. But they're saying that we need to give more subsidies, and for like to poor farmers and for supporting public food programs, allow us that. But that's heavily, heavily contested. And here again, don't forget the gender dimension. Women have to provide food, and a lot of women, I mean, you know, for example, for us, like when you go to these ration shops, we call like the shops to which these public food programs give out food and rice and so on, you will see a lot of women. They are collecting the food because they have the responsibility of feeding the family. And these programs are crucial for supporting food security across especially poor households in developing countries. Lastly, we have also the fisheries subsidies negotiations now. And you know, again, the challenge is, so the objective is great, that it is to all countries should reduce subsidies because you have to conserve fish stocks. Because the moment fish stocks are depleted, it actually hurts small fishers. They do not get the fish, right? Large trawlers will come and get the fish. But the thing is, at the same time, I mean, it's big industrial countries with industrial fishing who have actually caused this damage. So firstly, they should pay. And very small scale fishers in developing countries, they actually do sustainable fishing, you know. They are not really the ones causing damage. But now the way the negotiations are going, that their subsidies would be gone. And what we are weirdly seeing is that the rich countries, and EU is a major player and pushes on this, they are actually keeping their ability to give subsidies. And whereas there is heavy challenge that there should be minimum special and differential treatment, even to protect small fishers' subsidies in developing countries. So on the one hand, they're saying limit that, like no special and differential treatment. So it's just only for fishers who fish in like within 12 nautical miles. It's only for 2 years or only for 5 years. Whereas actually the large industrial subsidizers, I mean, China is one among the developing countries, but EU, all these countries who do distant water fishing, etc., they are actually able to keep their subsidies. So this is again, there's great danger that the fisheries subsidies negotiations will end up with the same inequity that the agreement on agriculture has brought us. And we have not learned from the agreement on agriculture, it seems. And then finally, sorry, Gaya, I'm not sure if I'm taking more time, Michelle, but I'll just finish in a minute. Like one big challenge now is, you know, as we are heading into the ministerial, so there's the TRIPS waiver, which is absolutely critical for us. But there are different, like I told you, this permanent solution, for example, that developing countries need. And there are other issues on agriculture. There's the issue in the fishery subsidies negotiations that small fishers in developing countries, they need to have their subsidies. So the problem is, you know, these will come to head, like they will come up against each other. And this is always been a strategy of the North, like to, you know, like you will have to do trade-off. Okay, if you want the waiver, will you give up the permanent solution or you give up small fishers' rights? I mean, what do we give up? How do we choose? I mean, if we do want vaccines, we want access to medicine, then do we give up on food sovereignty? Do we give up on the, you know, livelihoods and food security that small scale fishers and farmers in developing countries and that their continued production will bring us? So this is a challenge, like, you know, our governments, developing country governments have to kind of resist this pressure to give up something to get something else. And I think we really have to call on the EU and other developed countries, US and so on, not to put this pressure. Like this trade-off is not acceptable to us because it does not work. And so I think the question for women's groups will be really to engage. And TWN, like my organization, we are engaged with Dawn in this called Feminists for People's Vaccine campaign. I mean, some of you may have heard about it, and a lot of women's organizations are part of it. And why? Because they have an equal stake. What I say, it is TRIPS waiver, agriculture, fisheries. These are all women's issues. Every issue is a woman's issue. And I think this is the time really to engage, call on their governments in developed countries and in developing countries that we do want, like we want it. We want all these because these are our rights. Like we do not want something and then we give up something. I think these we do not want. And the history of the WTO has shown us, like, that there can be very severe and very unfair agreements. Yes. And these unfair agreements
you round up. Thanks.
Yes. Yeah. These unfair agreements really need to be challenged. Thank you so much.
Oh, it looks like I caught you on your last sentence there. Thank you so much, Ranja. That was very interesting. Thank you for the thorough background that she provided us on the politics and the history of the TRIPS agreement within the framework of the WTO, the challenges. You also highlighted issues pertaining to gender and TRIPS, and I like how you said that every issue is a gender issue, and that's really where we should take this conversation from. And then also, it seems within the agriculture and fisheries sector that the issue of subsidies is still problematic, and you've just highlighted that very well. So thank you so much for your presentation. And let me take this opportunity to thank both of the panelists for brilliant contributions that you made and what you've added to this conversation. Now we've received a few questions in the chat, and I'd like to just go through some of these, and we'll see how many we can go through. So the first question, which I will ask perhaps to Juan, I hope I'm not butchering your name. So you mentioned in your discussion that there's some information that's non-patent related, which you mentioned as undisclosed information. Can you explain a little bit what does that mean and what type of information could that consist of? And then what is the main ask, or what should be the main ask for the TRIPS waiver? And then also, I guess at the end of the day, we want to understand, can we strike a balance between big pharma and, or rather big pharma's profit motive and women's human rights or women's rights to health? So that's for you, Yuan. And then for Ranja, there's a question maybe to continue the conversation on women and TRIPS. How can girls, women, and the LGBTQI+ people from rural regions and indigenous backgrounds in particular, who are most affected by structural inequalities, how can they be actively involved?
Que normalmente son las más afectadas por las desigualdades estructurales.
Okay, I'm not sure if that was meant for me.
Sorry, I just I wanted to tell people that we don't have German interpretation right now for the questions, but if people have questions, we can take them up and give you an answer in German afterwards.
Perfect, thank you so much. That's very helpful. I see you've also added that in the chat. In case anyone didn't get that message, you can just have a look at the chat box. So for Ranja, there was that question on how women can become actively involved. Well, different groups that I've mentioned, including LGBTQI+. And there's also a question pertaining to the TRIPS agreement. From your discussion, it appears that this agreement is inherently unfair. So what needs to happen to correct this beyond the TRIPS waiver? What is the process in the WTO if countries want to leave such an agreement or renegotiate? Can they opt out? Is it in their best interest? And what would that entail? So maybe we can start off with those questions, and we can hear from Yuan first, and then we'll hear from you, Ranja.
Okay, I will start with the undisclosed information. I mean, there's multiple issues, and if we put simply, if we use the experience in this pandemic as example, there is some provisions and the TRIPS agreement saying that if for the purpose of prevent unfair competition, some of the clinical trial testing data related to medicines need to be protected. But some country went very far and to say, okay, for a certain period of time, it's only certain type of company that can use those clinical trial information to get registration, whereas others cannot. And then it's also ambiguity. So the clinical data itself, we probably think it's actually have a lot of public interest value for us to understand the safety and so on. They could be claimed as secret information under certain undisclosed protection. And then there is other type of data often held by regulatory body, for instance, the manufacturer protocol and manufacturer information, safety data, and so on, which if openly, or not really openly, but if made available to other producers, could have accelerated their preparation and then for production, and also for the regulator to have more reference. But then oftentimes when company apply for registration, they will claim everything as a secret that would packaged as undisclosed information. So in the pandemic now, what we anticipate the waiver and other measures should achieve is really to break out this monopolistic decision making, so that production supply can be facilitated. But if the key information that can facilitate quicker and diversified production are protected as a private secret, then some of this effort would be undermined. And on another, in other examples, for instance, if we want to know, for instance, what kind of terms and conditions company have signed with a government donor or other funding agency when the public funding are supporting the development of product, and the public funding may have some requirements how the technology need to be shared, but all of this important and term and condition could be claimed as a secret and under undisclosed information protection. That means that we actually don't, as a public and civil society, we probably have no source to really check the accountability and really to follow through and to say, okay, some of the term and condition are unfair, you need to redo it so that the technology can be widely shared to facilitate production and supply. So those are some examples, but there could be more. And what should be the main ask for TRIPS waiver from our perspective? Because now the key element under negotiation is really what kind of technology and product we're talking about. You know, whether it's only a vaccine patent, or because vaccine patent already have two dimensions. One is a type of product, one is a type of IP. For in our perspective, there should be no such limitation, because as we know, we need a vaccine, sure, but we also need other medical tools that are under the similar monopoly control. So the scope of the technology should include therapeutics, diagnostics, and other essential tools that the healthcare worker needs, and also the related information underlying technology, raw material that are needed to produce them, because the purpose of having the waiver others is for production. So people need the full package for production. And then the type of IP should go beyond the patent, also include undisclosed information and other, as long as it's related to production and supply. So that is how we see. And also the duration of the waiver should be long enough to enable country who implement the waiver to have sufficient time to prepare for production and supply. So these are the kind of three dimensions from our perspective should be asked for in the waiver process. Yeah. Do you want me to also go through the future, the balance one, or I let Ranja go first?
I'm thinking maybe let's hear from Ranja and then we can come back to you. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. Yes. So first question is, of course, specific communities who are really hurt by these very unequal agreements, right? And as I said, that unfair agreements, when they're implemented on the ground, becomes more unfair for more marginalized constituencies. So we have been, like, for example, we are engaged, I mean, TWN is also part of the Gender and Trade Coalition. Michelle is one of the co-chairs. So, and then we have the Feminists for People's Vaccine, as I told you. So there are different, campaigns and networks. And I think a lot of the women's rights networks on these issues, like the Gender and Trade Coalition and the Feminists for People's Vaccines campaign, really hinge a lot on intersectionalities. It's not only about women, men, but it's also different groups. For example, people living with disability, indigenous groups, LGBTIQ groups, all these marginalized groups who have less political clout, and how they bear the burden, like a kind of like an unfair burden of such unfair agreements. And so I think I would suggest, and we are always trying to reach out to these groups, because these specific impacts are very interesting. I think it's very important that you bring these voices and experiences to the ground, to the negotiators. So, when we work as an alliance, I think it gives us a lot of scope to hear about the impacts on specific groups. And then we try to take it up to our governments and to negotiators and so on. And sometimes, frankly, even, developing country negotiators are looking for these specific impacts, which they can then use to argue for a certain case, like for better, policies and rules from the WTO. So I think I would suggest, if, these groups, if they would actually try to become part of lot of these trade alliances. So Gender and Trade Coalition, but there's also Our World Is Not for Sale, lot of trade related alliances. And then I know in Europe, Seattle to Brussels Network, White Plus. So if you reach out to these coalitions, those who are already discussing these very unfair trade policies. And I think from when we operate these networks, it's also our responsibility to hear those specific, narratives, and then actually kind of bring those up and take it up to the government level and to the negotiating table. Yes, and I think, did you ask me another question, Pooja? Like how to walk out of the TRIPS agreement, right? I think that was Pooja's question, Michelle, that so, I mean, that is the difficult part of the WTO. The WTO is supposed to be a single undertaking, right? Like everything is agreed together. So all these agreements were kind of negotiated together and are supposedly balanced. Like I told you what kind of balance this was, but they're supposedly balanced. So it's difficult to kind of come out of one agreement. And it's challenging for one government to come out of anything. In any case, they are unable to come out even of investment treaties or even bilateral free trade agreements. So, I mean, but in any case, I would see it as quite unrealistic for governments to even agree to come out, say, of the TRIPS agreement. But I think it gives me a lot of hope. I mean, 2 years back, I would not have even thought that such a waiver proposal would be tabled, right? And I remember, Pooja, when the SDGs were negotiated, I was quite, I used to roam around those corridors at that time quite a bit. And then I remember France was trying to broker some language on technology. And then we raised IPR. He said, no touching IPR. That's like, you cannot touch. It's like bigger than God, okay? You cannot touch it. So, but I think that has been broken. I mean, whether we even get the waiver or not, I mean, it has shown that this paradigm of intellectual property rights is damaging. Many countries are realizing it. Global civil society is strongly behind it. I mean, I think this campaign got so much support across the board. I mean, across the board, from human rights rapporteurs to UN agencies to different donor agencies to, of course, civil society at large. I mean, it has generated such a lot of interest and involvement. We really need to use this to maybe totally change the TRIPS agreement. I mean, maybe Yuan is laughing. I'm being too, ridiculous. But this, I think, gives us actually this shows that it's not impossible. And, I mean, farmers, for example, have been saying agriculture out of the WTO. It has not happened because they are so closely enmeshed together. And there are certain advantages there, like you will still hope for equal treatment in the WTO and so on. But I think the WTO really needs to reform itself, like upside down to really cater to development.
Thank you so much, Ranja. I think that actually takes us to another kind of broad question on what exactly is the future of the WTO. There are issues now with TRIPS, there are issues with agriculture, there's contestation on so many areas on multilateralism and state sovereignty and that kind of thing. So I'll pose that question to you, but also more specific, you mentioned that the United States tends to rely on Article 301 at the expense of developing countries. Can you also explain what that article speaks to? And then you can speak to the future of the WTO. And I will not let one go off the hook on the question about the balancing act between corporate profit interest and the right to help. Should we be trying to strike a balance, or should one take priority over the other? What are your views? Let's hear from Ranja first. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So Article 301 is part of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974 that says that actually it kind of gives the responsibility to the U.S. trade representative, and it gives it certain authorities to investigate and take action to enforce US rights under its trade agreements. So, for example, the pharma lobby keeps complaining that their rights under the WTO has been kind of threatened or trampled on if a certain country, say, for example, takes out a compulsory license, and then the USTR has to investigate. They can take retaliatory action, and that's what they keep threatening with, that then I will slap subsidies on you or whatever. So that's a very, very kind of it gives it very broad powers to kind of investigate and take action. So that's why it has proved to be, and the US has used it like quite a bit, and it uses the threat of using it actually, I would say, and so that's the danger. And as I said, like even when countries were issuing compulsory licenses, which is permitted under the TRIPS agreement, under TRIPS flexibilities, even then the US, citing Article 301, keeps kind of putting pressure on governments that you should not do this. And for many smaller countries, it is very, very serious pressure. I mean, for example, India may say no. I mean, India has managed to kind of stand up to these, but many countries have not. Many countries have decided not to kind of pass any more compulsory license because of this pressure. And I don't know, future of the WTO, frankly, when the dispute settlement body was jammed, like in a way we were pretty happy, because it means that if everybody can break the rules, which means you don't have to implement the TRIPS agreement, you don't have to implement the agreement on agriculture, developing countries can give all the subsidies they want. But the fact is that, we have to recognize the political reality. I mean, what, for example, the EU can do or the US can do, Malawi cannot do, because they simply will face tremendous political pressure. So given that, we definitely would need maybe some kind of a multilateral institution, but we would like to think of, alternatives which are more progressive, based maybe on different values, not based so much on harsh, this commercial, just like trade and money making and profiteering is the only kind of way. And that also, I know what Yuan will respond, brings the role of corporations. Like they have heavy influence on the rulemaking in the WTO, right? Like through their governments, they exert a lot of influence, and that needs to be countered. But I am not even sure whether that's even possible at this stage, because, the WTO reform discussion, what is being pushed by the developed countries is worse than this current WTO. Whereas we from civil society have said we need WTO reform, for a WTO that works for small farmers, for fishers, for women, for indigenous people, for patients groups, and so on, and for the global South. But we seem to be heading in the opposite direction. So frankly, it still looks pretty bleak, and we are always firefighting, but maybe this TRIPS waiver will actually show the way. Let's see.
Thanks, Ranja. Over to you, Yuan. Just check, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. I think it's also Ranjan's very clear and articulation about what's the future. So in terms of the balance, the question now is actually there's no balance already. The supposed balance had been broken for a long time. So there is the assumption the system should be balanced as kind of a classic justification of having the IP system on different goods. There was an assumption there that it should be balanced about protection and dissemination of knowledge and technology to everyone. But that balance had not been achieved for quite a long time. Particularly due to I think two reasons. One is that assumption alone does not take into account how easy that supposed balance can be broken if there's no regulation on private sector's behavior. And secondly, the way how the system has been abused and excessively used for the one type of interest have broke that supposed balance. So for now, maybe the question is to relook at the kind of the flow when the balance was supposed to be there, but isn't there, and whether IP system alone is a right place to look at that kind of balance. So there's a lot of things need to be done also within the system, including revising, reforming the whole TRIPS and WTO, hopefully one day. But even within the current framework, there's a lot of issues need to be addressed for the government and public to regain some of the control. For instance, is this really justifiable to have so many patents on different aspects of medicine that doesn't really bring any innovation, because the patent has been used particular as a commercial tool to maintain the market monopoly. So even we use the other people's arguments, say IP is for innovation, but if we look closer, they are not bringing innovation at all. They are bringing monopoly. So is it really justifiable? And then some of the action need to be done to say, okay, we don't need so many patents. And then the country need to streamline how they review and examine and grant patents in the first place. And secondly, it should give more legal revenue for public and civil society to challenge those unjustifiable patents and unmerited protection. So those are the things country can already do now. Maybe not today, but taking the lessons learned. So those are maybe some of the actions can renegotiate the balance. But then there's also things need to be done outside of the IP system, because otherwise we will also negotiate within the system to look at how a different kind of model of change the upstream level of biomedical research and development can be done, so that the funding from public resources and the contribution from public and scientists will not just end it up with one company or two. So there should be a different way of governing scientific knowledge and research and output. So that probably require us to also pay more attention to process and discussions in WHO. For instance, there is a long-term process in WHO trying to strike that balance from a health perspective called the Global Strategy and Plan of Action. But that whole initiative have been slowed down deliberately because some countries just don't want to fund it or just don't want to come to the table and always block a developing countries' proposal. But that could potentially be a different revenue, a normative development outside of WTO.
Thank you so much. Very insightful responses. And I think your last sentence actually ties into a question that was put in the chat, or a comment rather, that maybe we need trade COPs like climate COPs with transparent negotiations. This is from Pooja. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. And the comment also goes on to say, I don't know whether the WTO whether the UN umbrella would work better for negotiating multilateral binding agreements. I see Ranja has responded in the comments, but just keeping an eye on the time, I'd like to invite our presenters, our panelists, to just give us your last remarks, your parting remarks in a minute. And then if there are any other questions or comments, of course, we're happy to respond in later email correspondence and that kind of thing. So any parting words from you? We'll start with Juan. Just in a minute, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I would just want to say maybe quote what Ranjan said. It's really encouraging in this past more than year how the waiver discussion actually connects to a broader global movement for justice, and not only for access medicine, for human rights, for gender, for equality, for equity. So this is really a very encouraging moment for all of us working from different aspects in civil society, and hopefully this will continue, because we cannot afford to have the same kind of crisis in the next pandemic. In order to do so, we need to come together working on a new kind of norm and architecture that serve people who are disadvantaged to have a more justice and fairness in the society as a whole, in order to be prepared for the next public health challenge.
Thank you, Ranja.
I mean, I think it's really time we say no to, these really very, very damaging provisions in not only the WTO, but also the free trade agreements and investment treaties. For example, we've been saying, like, since the COVID pandemic started last year, we've been saying moratorium on all trade and investment agreements, because these are really constraining policy space of our governments to address the pandemic. And the pandemic has shown us that how, after so many years of globalization, we are still not able to produce anything, frankly. We are still dependent, and a few countries still produce everything that we need. And when we say that, okay, no, we want to develop our own manufacturing capacity, then but these trade rules that you are bound by, you have to comply with. So I think it's time we thought of trade agreements and trade and investment policies that really suit our needs. And if not, then we simply do not, we cannot allow them to constrain our policy space anymore. If not, they will have to be turned upside down. And as we are discussing, there seems to be this impetus, and even a lot of governments are, I think, energized. Like before, when they would think that, no, it's not possible. But now that what is possible, I think, has shifted big time. And this is the time for civil society to push, and then to really, but for we have to also do the hard work. What will work? What is the alternative? What would it look like? What are these ideas? How they would be how could they be implemented? We need to have the blueprint, and then we need to also push and use this opportunity if we really want to have an alternative paradigm.
Thank you so much, Iwan and Ranja. Thank you for the great presentations. Thank you for the great parting words. Our work is cut out for us, and you've made it very clear, even for people that are not familiar with this subject. We know a lot of people shy away from technical discussions, like the TRIPS agreement is very technical, but you've made it so simple and easy to understand. So thank you so much for your presentations. Thank you again to our audience, our listeners. Thank you for your questions. And I also want to say thank you once again to the organizers, Forum Umwelt und Entwicklung, White Plus, Women Equals Men, Anders Handel, Gender and Trade Coalition, and Seattle to Brussels Network. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and I wish you enjoy the rest of your day. I'm not sure what time zone you're in, but thank you so much and take care. Bye.
Thanks to you, Michelle. Thanks, Kea, and thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much.